Well, today on Frame, a familiar voice and face to the soccer community. It's Derek Rae, a longtime soccer commentator, Aberdeen native, attended the University of Aberdeen. He called games in the past for the New England Revolution, the Metro Stars, the LA Galaxy. He used to co-host a show called ESPN Press Pass, which a lot of us watched. It's now ESPN FC. He's called 6 World Cups, Champions League, Europa League, Scottish Premiership, of course, Bundesliga, Premier League. Wow. Very cool to have you here. Derek Rae, welcome. How are you?
I'm well, Glenn. Thank you for that introduction, and also delighted to be on with you. Looking
Thank you
forward to
so
it.
much. So let's trace your roots a little bit. Aberdeen. When I think of Aberdeen, I think of Sir Alex.
Yep.
And I also think of a guy named Bobby Clark, who I got to know when I worked in the Big East Conference, and he was Sir Alex's goalkeeper for a while there, and he told some great stories. But tell us a little bit about Aberdeen and the football side of things there.
Well, I'm glad you've mentioned right off the bat 2 of my favorite Aberdeen people, not Aberdonians by birth like me, but they were certainly very influential in my formative years as a football fan in Aberdeen. Now, Bobby Clark, who was the goalkeeper when I first went to Pittodrie to watch Aberdeen in the early mid-1970s, was an iconic figure. He was everywhere in Aberdeen. He was a footballer. He was a basketball player, a very good basketball player. He was also one of my teachers. So that's how small, that's how small the world is in Aberdeen. Everybody sort of, especially then, knew everybody else.
And he's an excellent teacher. I mean, the way I really got to know him was going to some clinics and watching him operate. And I still use some of the words that he used to describe, like drift and explode for the players in the midfield and up top. Drift and explode. And and when you engage with him, when you chat with him, just a wonderful guy.
Absolutely. And I always found that with Bobby, and I still keep in touch with him from time to time as well. Alex Ferguson came on the scene in the late 1970s. Now, what I should tell you about his role in our city is this. Before that, Aberdeen were a bit of a yo-yo team. We sort of underperformed at times. We did challenge for honours. We won the League Cup in Scotland, 1976. First trophy I can remember as a young fan at the Dons, as we call them, lifting. But then Fergie arrives and everything changes pretty quickly, and we became winners, and he really made the team winners. And it was interesting to watch what he did. People talk about him as a football manager. I firmly believe that Alex Ferguson, in any walk of life, would have been a success had he chosen to be a lawyer or a doctor, had he had the educational privilege, which he didn't have, coming from a working class part of Scotland then. Had he had that educational privilege, he would have been a success in any field. But what he did, and it sounds like a small thing, was he evangelized a city. And people still talk about it to this day. When he first arrived in Aberdeen, city of 200,000, he made it his business to go to every dinner, function, dance, you name it. And he had this photographic memory. He would remember meeting people at these different functions. And he sort of saw it as his job to go out there and spread the gospel about this team he was building. Because everybody was a fan in the city, to a greater or lesser extent. But we weren't winners. But in a short space of time, he made Aberdeen, and this is no exaggeration, Glenn, the best team in Europe. And the statistics will show that. For a period in the early mid-1980s, Aberdeen were the best team in Europe. And as I say, the rankings, which were fledgling rankings back then, will back that up. If you win the Cup Winners' Cup, beating Bayern and Real Madrid, quarterfinal and final respectively, and then go on to win the Super Cup against Hamburg, who had won the European Cup, I think that speaks for itself. And it was to a large extent down to Fergie and his ability to mold a team. And my goodness, he became rather good at that once he went south of the border as well.
He said mold a team and also mold a community. And I spoke to someone recently who talked about Fergie and other coaches and a quality that's so important is, if you meet one of your players' grandparents, you remember their name and then you ask about them again. And then it seems like maybe that's the kind of quality where he was able to galvanize all the time.
Yeah, I think he knew that that was a big side of management back then. And obviously, the tactics are always important. I mean, that goes without saying. You have to have an understanding of tactics, but you do have to have an understanding of people and how they function. And it's not always pretty when you're a football coach or manager dealing with different personalities. And you have to know how they all tick. And, you know, that team in 1983, this would be after Bobby Clark's time. Bobby had left by then. But there was a player called John Hewitt who played for Aberdeen. And Fergie writes about this quite a lot, even to this day. John Hewitt was a local boy. He was talented. He was in and out of the team, but he was a little bit sensitive compared to some of the other players. And Fergie knew that, you know, the hairdryer that we talk about a lot, the hairdryer could be dished out to certain players, but not really to John Hewitt, because he realized that that was counterproductive. Not every manager gets that. You know, a lot of people in life, managers in life generally, can be a bit one-noted, you know, and this is how I do it. And I'm not going to adjust to anybody. I'm not going to compromise. But even though we think of Fergie as this sort of uncompromising figure, maybe the ultimate uncompromising figure, it's my way or the highway, he still had the texture within him to understand that certain players will react to approach A, others need an approach B.
Derek Rae, our guest, football commentator, longtime football commentator. What's behind you? Berwick Rangers Black and Gold Army. What's that all about?
Well, that's actually something new. Now, I should explain that, yeah, you can see that behind me. Black and gold, distinctive colors. Berwick Rangers, as the team is pronounced, the town is pronounced.
Thank you. I know how I've read how you are. You'll go to like the consulate or the embassy to make sure that you're pronouncing guys' names correctly, right?
I do. But this is quite a special team because Berwick is actually a border town, technically in England, just to the south of the Scottish border, just a couple of miles. But for their entire history, and they go a long way back, they have always played in Scotland. And they recently went through hard times and got themselves into the non-league, into the Lowland League, having been a fixture in the Scottish League itself. So they're trying to sort of build back, and they were responsible for the biggest upset in the history of the Scottish Cup back in 1967, when they ousted the more famous Rangers from Glasgow. And it's still talked about to this day. Yeah, everybody in Scotland, if you ask them biggest upset in Scottish Cup history, they'll say Berwick Rangers. So they approached me recently, just out of the blue. I wasn't doing very much in the early part of lockdown. And they said, you know, and I sort of put it out there. I said, if anybody, particularly a small Scottish club, needs some voiceover work, I'm free. I'm happy to do it, pro bono. So they got in touch. I did a bunch of work for them. And then they followed up by saying, could we maybe just sort of have a little arrangement whereby we call you our international club ambassador? And I said, you know what, I would love to. I'd be flattered because I love the Berwick story. I mean, it would be the equivalent of having an American team on the border playing in Mexico or in Canada or vice versa. And I just think it's something that's noteworthy. And so I've been doing my little bit to tell the world about Berwick Rangers and their.
Well, congratulations. I mean, I'll check your Twitter a little bit more thoroughly, make sure I retweet some of those things. Derek, before we get to some of the things you've been doing and building during the isolation and the quarantine here, because you haven't been able to do games, if any.
True.
Your move to the States and your introduction to MLS. Yeah. So for a guy from your part of the world, you know, what initiated that, and what did you think of football in the States when you first arrived?
Well, I first arrived here in Boston. I'm talking to you from the Boston area in 1991. I'd been here on vacation a few times. I had fallen in love with the area. I found that it spoke to me for whatever reason. And I'd been at the BBC for 5 years. And like most young people, looking back, certainly, I was a bit impatient. I had got to do a lot in my 5 years at the BBC. And the logical path for somebody from Scotland was then to move from Glasgow, where I was based, to London, to the headquarters in London. But I, was a little bit of a contrarian. And I said, I don't want to do that. I want to sort of make my own way. I want to try something that nobody has tried before. So I had made a few connections with some of the representatives of the World Cup Organizing Committee here in the USA. And we'd met at the World Cup in Italy in 1990, which I'd been covering for BBC Radio. And we sort of just left it as, well, if ever you're in the States, give us a shout. So I decided, and again, it sounds a bit crazy, I gave up a very good job at the BBC to chance my arm in the USA with no prospects. And I came here initially to do a little bit of studying at a local broadcasting school to see how they did things here in the US, just to sort of, get my foot in the door and to, really to observe, because I thought, I'm coming to a totally different culture. Yeah. That was helpful. And then I thought, well, maybe I can stay on and do a bit of freelance journalism and broadcasting. I did bits and pieces of that. But before that ever really took hold, I met with the people from the World Cup Organizing Committee, and I ended up being their media officer here in the Boston venue. And so that took effect a couple of years before the World Cup.
That's fun.
Oh, Glenn, honestly, when I look back at that now, I regard it as one of the most fun times of my entire life. My goodness, it was hard work. We were working, I was up in the morning. It seemed at 4 a.m. I wouldn't go to bed till about 11 p.m. It was round the clock, and it was different because I'd come from broadcasting, and here I was now an organizer, trying to learn a new country as well and how the USA works. But the reason why they hired me was they said, well, we need somebody like you who comes from ideally a world football background, and,
right.
and we don't have a lot of people like that. You've lived and breathed the game every day at the sharp end for the years you've been at the BBC. They liked the fact that I had a languages background as well, and so I sort of threw myself into it. I didn't know a lot about the organizational side of setting up media facilities. That's something I had to sort of learn on the job, but found that I really loved that. And I tell you what I especially loved, and this is the interesting thing again looking back. In those days in the USA, obviously, not that many people were familiar with the World Game. But one of the advantages of working for an organizing committee around the World Cup is you have big names from the world of football coming into your venues to check out facilities and, to just get the lay of the land. So we would get faxes. Remember faxes back in those days? We would receive, you and I are about the same vintage. We would get faxes from different, federations, associations saying, Dick Advocaat, the Netherlands manager, is coming in. Could somebody drive him around to have a look at the different training facilities? Similarly, Alfio Basile of Argentina, and down the list you go. So I, of course, being the one, not going to say the only one, but probably the loudest actual football fan amongst our small group of workers at Government Centre, where the headquarters was at the time for the World Cup Organising Committee, would always say, well, I'll do it. I'll take Mr. Advocaat around. And of course, as a journalist, as a broadcaster, at least in terms of my training, it was fascinating. The only thing was
So when you're driving around the car with the Dick Advocaat, were you interviewing him at the same time?
Well, I was interviewing him in my own mind, but I had to, obviously I had to be careful.
That's what I meant. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
You're conducting an interview, but informally.
Yeah, absolutely. And, some of the things he said, obviously, were not for broadcast and not for publication. Right. Not that he said anything that was incriminating at all, of course. But it was just, the whole fascination of it. And being inside that inner sanctum during the World Cup period, which you are as the media officer for the organization. And I got to know a lot of people. I got to, I think, understand the US mentality with regard to sports more, because one of the jobs, and maybe sort of the less pleasant side of the job, was dealing with a lot of, dare I say it, quite hostile media entities here in the USA back then. I think much more so than would be the case nowadays. So, even the local papers, the Boston Globe, the Boston Herald, a big part of the job was meeting regularly with the editorial staff of those papers and trying to explain to them really what the World Cup was. You and I know, how big the World Cup is. I think people generally now know how big it is. Back then, it was still a bit of an explanatory process. And they were a bit worried about access. Were they going to get the same access that they got covering the Patriots or the Red Sox? And the answer to that, quite frankly, was no. This is a world, it's a world event. And we don't, we're not going to change how media protocols are done, just for the local media. So you kind of have to get on board. So that was a bit of a political job, if you like. And it taught me an awful lot. And I'm so grateful to Jim Trecker, who was the head of media for the World Cup, but who I'm still in touch with from time to time, for the faith that he had in me. And, I would say he's probably the best boss I've ever had anywhere. And it really sort of set the table for MLS, as you mentioned. Without the World Cup, there wouldn't have been MLS. And as I said, it really allowed me to have a deeper understanding of how things work, particularly with the sport in this country.
Yeah, what some don't understand that aren't involved with the current MLS and American sports is that media is allowed in the locker rooms, and that's forbidden in every other part of the world. So I know these Europeans that come in, South Americans, wherever, any of the internationals, at first they're like, why is everybody in the locker room? And even the coaches, with New York City FC, it's been Patrick Vieira, Dominic Torron, and now Ronnie Dyla, and they're not used to having media training. We go to training once a week, so it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, culturally, there is a divide that way in terms of how it's covered. And that was maybe the hardest thing that I had to get across. And, I made enemies, I freely admit now. I made a lot of enemies with local media, not with the soccer media, not with the writers, people like Mike Lewis, who's still around in New York, and Frank DeLappa, who's a friend of mine in Boston. These guys are soccer, football people. But the people who would sort of dip in and out of it, the local TV channels, or at times other people from the Globe and the Herald who weren't, really into the sport that much. It became difficult because, I was telling them what they didn't want to hear. And, a few of them wrote nasty articles about that side of it. I would have to say, though, I think they wanted to write those nasty articles, many of them, because it did suit their own individual agenda.
Yeah, well, rough with the local TV. I'm certain of that. Derek Rae, our guest, commentator on the soccer side. I know you've done other sports as well. You mentioned the languages. How many languages do you speak?
Well, the only one I'm fluent in is German, but I dabble in a few others. So I taught myself Spanish, but it's nowhere near the level of my German. French, I learned at school, and my French is okay, but not fluent like German. And little bits of Dutch, which I work on from time to time when I have a spare hour here and there.
Now, I heard this story. Is this true that when you came to America and started broadcasting games, that you used an American accent to do the games, and then eventually you brought in the old Scottish brogue? But is that true?
Well, I don't know if it was quite an American accent, but it was more of an American style. And I'll be honest, Glenn, part of this was after I landed in America and spoke to a few people at different TV channels, it became very clear to me, and it's funny how the world might have changed a bit. It was very clear to me back then that my accent, and I'm talking to you as a Scot now, I hopefully sound like a Scot or certainly like somebody from other side of the Atlantic, even though I've lived here for a long time, my accent was not going to be welcome on air as a commentator. And it sort of comes in phases, this. People sort of assume now, I hear a lot from people, all these British accents, if you have a British accent, you get on TV. Ain't necessarily so. That was not my experience when I arrived in the USA in the early 90s at all. In fact, and I don't remember there being British accents covering the US national team or covering the little limited soccer that there was on TV back then. It was only much later that shifted, probably well into the 2000s before that really became in vogue. So I decided, well, listen, if I'm going to be here in the USA and I want to make a living, then I've got to be commercially viable. And so, I did. I modified my style a little bit, not for long, but for a few years to make it more American. And I would use more American words, and I probably would, exaggerate things because I wanted to be clear as well. I wanted people to understand me. Not that I think anybody would have a real problem understanding me nowadays, hopefully.
No, not at all.
But that was the thinking. However, I'll tell you that there was a sort of a trigger as to why I finally decided, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to, try and play that game. At ESPN International, where I worked as well, doing the Brazilian League, the Dutch League, Champions League, we got rights to the Scottish League for a spell. And it was when I was given a Scottish game, which obviously I was delighted to have. I'd been away from Scotland for a long time. And suddenly doing the Scottish teams again, I said to myself, I can't be anything other than a Scot doing this. I can't go in and pronounce a Scottish name the way an American might, because I'm Scottish, you know? It would be like somebody from Texas, landing in the UK and saying I'm going to suddenly say Texan town names the way a British person might say them. It just didn't make any sense to me. And
this is fascinating. So you're like an actor, you go into your different part and you have to use your different dialects and.
Well, I think that comes from the languages background a little bit, because when I speak German, for example, I don't want to speak German with my Scottish accent and Scottish sounds. I want to sound German, So that, I think, has always influenced me a little bit. And I think it probably influenced me when I came to the USA. I sort of thought, well, it's the polite thing to, even though it's English, there is American English and there is British English. But, it's been a long time since I went down that road. And, I look back on it as a period in my life that was important developmentally. And I'll be honest, I don't think I would have got early broadcasting gigs here in the USA at that time if I were sounding the way I sound during this broadcast.
Well, all right. Derek Rae with us. So now you talk about Germany and the Bundesliga. So during this quarantine, during the pandemic, hashtag back garden Bundesliga. I have to tell you, Derek, I'm disappointed that you're not doing this interview, in your garden. I was looking forward to that. But tell us how you created that. I've seen some of them. The most recent one I think I might have seen, Werder Bremen avoiding relegation, which was huge for the U.S. We tend to look at the teams that have the U.S. players. Nationals, like Josh Sargent with Bremen, but. How did you come up with the idea?
It was totally random. I was giving some thought as to what I could do to try to help people follow the Bundesliga, because it's probably the league that's closest to my heart, Glenn, the Bundesliga. And again, it goes back to cultural things and the fact that I was a German student and I love the language, I love the country. I spent a lot of time there, most of the time in normal times, working for the World Feed as one of the commentators. So I fly back and forth as often as I can. I do a chunk of games while I'm there for the World Feed. But I realized that with the pandemic, this wasn't going to happen and wasn't going to happen anytime soon. So I was a little bit frustrated. I was stuck at home like many, no problem there because we're all in the same boat. But I thought, okay, the Bundesliga is coming back. I tweet a lot about the Bundesliga. Obviously, I read the language, speak the language, read stuff every day. So, how about using this as a bit of a public service? And it could be a bit of fun too. I could be out in the back garden. I love our back garden here. I don't get to spend enough time in my back garden. Thank you.
Well, you've had more time to work on the garden, that's for sure.
Well, I should give my wife credit because she really is the gardener in the family. I get to show it off to people on Twitter, but she's the one that really puts in the hard yards on it. But I thought, this is a great chance to tell people about the Bundesliga and to share my passion for it. Because the one thing I've always felt as a German speaker is that English football gets the sort of the royal treatment from people, especially in the USA, with regard to stories and the history and how magical it all is. And it is magical. There's no doubt about that. But most other countries have their football magic as well. And Germany absolutely does. But most of the stories have gone untold down the years, I think for linguistic reasons, because it's much easier to be able to pick up something and read it in English coming from England, whereas, the translation is involved. And so I thought, well, I'm in a slightly privileged position here because I know all these stories. I've never really had an outlet to use to tell them except during my commentaries on air, but now I actually have a bit of time. So I thought, wouldn't it be fun to just sit in the back garden, maybe with some nice scenery, some soothing scenery, and just talk.
It worked.
Yeah, talk for a couple of minutes. And honestly, I hardly saw a bad negative comment from anybody on social media.
I pulled out a tweet from FCB London.
Yeah.
And replying to something you put out, love the passion that you exude for Bundesliga. It's infectious. And then he wrote more Ravid and less COVID going forward, please.
Well, I'll take that every day. Well, thank you for that comment. No, and honestly, it was a joy to do it. I would get up in the morning. I'm an early riser anyway. I tend to be up kind of at 5
Well,
a.m.
that's
most mornings.
for those
Yeah.
watching this interview. I've been
Yes.
sipping on coffee. We're doing a little bit of a morning recording here, but go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I tend to be up with the birds in the morning, and I thought obviously I can't do it too early because we have neighbors like everybody else here. But if I get up early and do this, it sort of gave me motivation to think about every game in a different way as well. And I more or less did it. In fact, I did it for every single match day following the restart, including all the relegation playoff matches, the cup as well, the cup semi-finals and the cup final itself. And with a bit of luck, I've managed to, if you like, spawn a few new Bundesliga fans who maybe had a vague interest before, but now are going to be watching it a lot more closely. So if that's the case, brilliant.
Well, and the Bundesliga back first, really the first major league that was playing games because, they handled the pandemic and COVID in a way that, and you wrote it, better than the U.S., better than the U.K. And the thing I thought I found interesting and something you wrote recently was that the German citizens are still being very cautious, despite the fact that it's been handled so well. And so there's something there in that you talk about being engulfed in the culture there. There's something about it that that community is handling this properly.
Yeah, I think, again, it's a very interesting cultural study. And I think during this pandemic, without going too much off topic, I think we have all recognized different traits in ourselves. And one of the things that I've noticed, and again, I've spent a lot of time in Germany, and also I come from Scotland, where the culture is, pretty unique too. And I think that some people are rule followers, some people are not. I didn't realize before this pandemic that I am actually quite a rule follower. I'm quite a stickler for rules when it comes, and I think that comes down to my feeling that we are all in things together, and that my bad behavior will adversely affect you. You know what I mean? And not everybody sees things that way. I fully appreciate that some people think, no, look after yourself and let everybody else worry about themselves. I just think that this pandemic has brought home that it's not always possible just to think about ourselves and that be enough. There are times, and there are other issues where this is the case as well, where we do have to think globally, and we do have to find global solutions. And, my problem is your problem, and vice versa. And so, yeah, that has been interesting. Yeah, and there are one or two people in Germany who don't like wearing masks, but since it came in several months ago now that masks were compulsory in public transport settings, in supermarkets, in shops,
Sure.
The vast majority have adhered to that. And here in the USA, it's been a bit more difficult to get everybody on board. I will say here in my state of Massachusetts, I think it has been very well observed. And in New York, I hear similar things. So it maybe is variable according to where you are in the USA, but I would say here in Massachusetts, people have done well on that front.
All right, Derek Rae with us. Let's get back to the sporting side of things. We talk about players, American players that are in Germany and succeeding. Certainly the most recent, Gio Reyna, who's at 17 is just tearing it up. But on the coaching side, this story has fallen a bit under the radar. A guy named Pellegrino Matarazzo, and Stuttgart, earning promotion to the top tier. This is a guy who's from New Jersey, where I live. He went to Columbia University, but he was tutored a bit by Nagelsmann when they were both at Hoffenheim. So I would imagine there's some influence there. But what can you tell us about Matarazzo? Because to me, this is a fantastic story.
Yeah, it is a fantastic story. And I've been a bit surprised how slowly his story has sort of come out in the USA. Maybe, obviously, because he's been away for a long time. And when you're away, you're slightly forgotten about. I mean, I give him terrific credit. He again, I mentioned earlier, taking the path less well, trodden. He went his own way by going to Germany, down the divisions, certainly not for money, certainly not for glory. He did it at a young age. Right. And there he has made a career for himself. And, I hear him being interviewed on German TV. He speaks perfect German, fluent German. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how he does. His contract was renewed not so long ago, and I'm actually quite friendly with Thomas Hitzelsberger, who's the man who makes all the decisions at Stuttgart. Great player he was, as you'll remember, and now is in a very senior capacity there at Stuttgart. And he was the man who announced recently that the contract had been extended. And this was actually in the heat of a promotion fight that was pretty intense, mostly between Stuttgart and Hamburg, two huge clubs who found themselves in the second division. Hamburg will be in the second division again next season. Stuttgart made it up. So I think that where I would stop short is I don't think it was a wonderful achievement by him to win promotion, but I will definitely give him credit because previously with Tim Walter in charge there, it looked as though it might not happen. So he got them to turn the corner, and he did what they thought he should do, which was, of course, win them promotion. The real test for him will be in the heat of battle in the top flight next season if Stuttgart get off to a bad start in the Bundesliga. Usually clubs are somewhat patient, but if they were to find themselves in the bottom two moving towards December, then we'll see. But I know that Thomas is committed to him. He likes him. He likes his ideas. You mentioned Julian Nagelsmann and what he learned there working under the young prodigy at Hoffenheim, now at Leipzig, of course. And I think it's great that American fans, and especially in your part of the country, Glenn, have somebody to latch onto and relate to.
Yep, that's going to help with the those that want to follow the Bundesliga, Derek Rae.
Yep.
And you mentioned Hamburg. They have a new coach, which you wrote about a bit, and it seems like it's a big deal now. It's a black man, Daniel Thun. So tell us a little bit about him, and why is it a big deal? Is it because Black Lives Matter is obviously at the forefront? We saw the demonstration pre-game of MLS is back on opening night, and it's something that's really on the top of everyone's minds here in the States in particular. But is that an important consideration here with this hiring?
Yes, I mean, it's definitely worthy of note, but I think we would all say that any of us who have studied his work as a coach, Daniel Thun, we would say that he's there completely on merit. I mean, Hamburg didn't go out and find somebody to tick a box necessarily in this case. They went for the person who they thought was the fit for their situation, and they're trying to be a bit younger, to be stylistically a little bit different, to have a really hard-working, passionate team, and they wanted a coach who was a fit for that sort of setup. So Daniel Thun has really surpassed all expectations at Osnabrück, just down the road, not quite down the road, but in the same general part of Germany as Hamburg in the north, and he certainly has caught the eye, not just of Hamburg, but of quite a few people. And I've never met him, but I've listened a lot to his interviews, and he comes across as a very empathetic figure, somebody who I think will work well with younger players, somebody who is probably, as I said, a very good match for what Hamburg need. And, I think there's no getting away from it. The timing is important here, and Bundesliga and second Bundesliga clubs are more than doing their bit for Black Lives Matter and making it clear that is important in German society as a whole. So I really wish him well.
Derek, I want to get your opinion on water breaks and 5 substitutions, which has been instituted for the obvious reasons of the player's health. With the long break and then coming back and really having to play matches probably before they were physically and maybe even mentally ready. Kerry Bowley, who I've interviewed before and know a little bit from the City Football Group, he's the head of coaching support. He tweeted something out. He said, "I'd actually like to see the water breaks and increased substitutions remain post-COVID. Additional coaching moments. I've been fascinated by the different approaches taken by coaches and their impact on the games." I did reply to that, and just to have a little fun too, but to me, the beauty of the game sort of is that the coach is in charge in the training sessions and in the instruction leading up to the game. And then it's kind of the player's job to figure it all out during the course of that. Now, I would relish the opportunity midway through the first half and midway through the second half of every game to talk to my team, especially if things weren't going well. But what do you think?
I'm not a great fan of the water breaks unless they are there for the reason that they were brought in, namely that it's far too hot. I worry that we're going down a slippery slope if we suddenly think, okay, well, we could turn this into a timeout type situation a la other American sports.
Yeah, it'd be like a TV timeout. All of a sudden you
Yeah.
take 2 minutes away or something.
And actually, Glenn, I first saw this covering Brazilian football back in the 1990s on ESPN. And they had a little flirtation with a break at the 22, 23-minute mark. And it was ostensibly because it was hot in Brazil at that time of year. And there was talk at the time about how, well, it could become 4 quarters and this would be good for TV. And then it was knocked on the head. And I would hope this does get knocked on the head. I totally understand that we're in a strange time at the moment. Players have had to come back on an accelerated timetable, and we should do everything we can to make sure that health needs are looked at. And in tandem with that, the 5 substitutes, fine as a short-term measure. As a commentator, I hate it because one of the beauties is that we have 3 substitutes, 3 substitutions at least in a game. And I think, friendlies are devalued when we have 7, 8, 9 substitutions made. I don't like that at all. I think you lose the focus of what the game was at the start.
It's definitely more difficult to, as the broadcaster, did my first New York City FC game at the MLS's back, and all of a sudden, they're substituting 2 and 3 at a time, and and you're calling the game off the monitor, so you really can't see, it's an extra challenge. How everything's going,
Yeah, 100%. That's not easy. Again, I try to have sympathy because I was looking just today at the Bundesliga schedule, which came out for next season. And that is going to be grueling because they're not going to start until September. And they normally have a winter break that it could be sort of 4 or 5 weeks, depending on the year.
Yeah.
The winter break is going to be about 8 or 9 days. And they're going to cram in all these games. And then you've got European matches, you've got cup games on top of that in a very concentrated timetable, all to finish by the 22nd of May ahead of the Euros. And I think to myself, okay, I do want to be sympathetic here. So, what can we do to ease the burden on players? Because it's not going to be easy. However, the more I think about it, having the 5 substitutes, inherently helps the better teams. It does because they have bigger, deeper squads. And, there are times when really good players don't get a game because they play for a big team and there's competition for places. And I heard Frank Schmidt, the coach of Heidenheim in the playoff, before the playoff recently in Germany, making an articulate point. He was saying it's kind of devaluing almost the importance of the starting 11. So we still talk a lot about, well, is he going to start today? What's the first 11 going to be? When you have 5 substitutes, and Frank Schmidt said this, he goes, it's not really that important whether you start or not, because you can make a change after 15 minutes and it's not going to necessarily hurt the flow of things. So I think all these things, I think as long as they are short-term measures, I can get behind them. I would hate to see this continue into, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. Just my personal opinion.
Derek, are you surprised that other leagues across the world, and maybe I might, there might be others that do this, but the winter break, what's the German phrase for the winter break in the Bundesliga?
Winterpause. Winterpause.
Yes. So it just makes so much sense, but I would imagine it doesn't make financial sense in some leagues. There must be some loss of TV revenue or something, but the players are pushed to such a degree nowadays that it just seems to me that break, I'll say it again. It just makes sense from the player standpoint and the level of play that you can get in the second half. What do you think?
Yeah, I've always been a huge fan of the Winterpause, the winter break, as we mentioned there. I like the fact that, and again, this goes back to years and years watching German football. I like the fact that everything is sort of structured in Germany, that you have match days 1 to 17. The halfway stage is hit right before Christmas. You take your break. You take your 4-5 weeks off. Players can recuperate. You sort of go through the training process again. It's a bit like a reset. And I think as fans, and again, maybe I'm speaking just for myself, we all need that reset. I actually get quite overwhelmed. People talk about the magic of the fixtures in England over Boxing Day and then around New Year. People talk about how great that is. And listen, it might be great for a lot of fans. I can only speak for myself. I actually get a little bit tired watching it all during Christmas and New Year. Now, I accept that that's because I work in the industry and I'm constantly working on the game. I actually enjoy the break. I like the way that Germany has traditionally done it. I like being able to switch off for a little while, observe what's happening, the news, the transfer news in January, and as the teams go to their various locations to train. I love all that. And then you look forward to it again. And you can't look forward to something if it's in your face every day. I'm having a bit of trouble, I have to say, at the moment. The Premier League seems to be in my face every day. I love the Premier League, but I like to look forward to it. You know, I like to have a few days before the weekend to anticipate. But at the moment, I can't really anticipate because it's on at all hours of the day. Listen, these are exceptional circumstances. We all understand why it has to be that way. But I'm not sure I'd want that to be reality day in, day out, week in, week out.
I have to ask you this, piped in fan sound or no piped in fan sound, just natural effects? And then I'll tell you what I like best.
No, good. I'll be curious to hear what you like best. I wondered what I would like best, but here's my answer. Now, the Bundesliga came back, obviously, before any other major league. And the interesting thing is, if you have been watching the games in Germany as opposed to in the UK or the USA, the default position is you watch the games with only the organic sounds of the players, the coaches from the stadium, with the echoes, warts and all, if you like. If you want the enhanced audio, as they call it, you have to push a few buttons. You know, you can do that as a streaming option and you have to push a few buttons, but 90% of fans are not exposed to that. So I listen to a lot of my German football on the radio, and again, we're not exposed to that on the radio. So I love my German football, and I like reality. And maybe, again, this comes back to journalistic training, I don't know. I accept that there's a showbiz element to it, and I accept that for some people, the rhythm of the crowd and the sounds are all part of the attraction. Where I get confused on this one is, and again, it's just a personal opinion.
I think we're gonna agree.
We're going to agree. Yeah, I think we are. The players are not hearing these enhanced sounds.
Right.
You know, so that is not the dynamic inside the stadium. So a player gets a yellow card, you are not hearing loud boos as the player trots away. I would, again, it's just personal. I would rather have reality. I would rather have a reflection, a depiction, you know, of what is actually happening inside the stadium. I accept that there are many people who take the complete opposite view, who need that soundtrack in order for it to be interesting. I just think that we're in a different time. Who knows how long we'll be in this period for, but I would rather have organic versus artificial.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. And, you know, part of it is, you know, as a coach, you kind of look forward maybe to seeing, you know, hearing some things that you normally wouldn't be able to hear, but it shouldn't be just for those who coach or play. It's just even supporters, you think, would like to hear some of the things going on. And I think I give Amy Rosenfeld and ESPN some credit in this MLS is back, what they're trying to do. And they've got 6 microphones under the ground, you know, and they're attached to the goalposts and they're by the benches. And after this first broadcast, some of the feedback was maybe we should even on radio, just lay out a little bit on corner kicks and set pieces where the goalkeeper is giving some really, you know, firm instruction and try to hear that. So those are the things, you know. But when the Bundesliga came back, I don't speak German. So, you know, the natural effects, I still preferred that, but I really didn't know what they were saying. Saying a lot of the time. So no, there's that aspect too.
Yeah, and that is an important aspect. Listening to some of the referees who've been interviewed about this, you know, they have said that their job has changed a bit with no fans inside the stadium. And it's actually led to, if you like, 1 or 2 officials getting into trouble more often than they might have done, quite simply because what they're saying is audible. And again, that to me comes back to the reality of it. You know, if something egregious is said and an official, as is the case now, or can be the case, is, you know, sent off, I think we want to know about that, you know, because the referee has access to that information in a way that he or she didn't have before with the crowd in place. So I just think it takes away that dynamic. And again, I do speak German, so I've rather enjoyed listening to Julian Nagelsmann, saying things like Gottes Willen, for goodness sake, das ist Wahnsinn, that's rubbish, that's nonsense.
Yes.
Normally we don't hear that, but again, if you're not a German speaker, then obviously
the one thing about MLS is that there are a lot of Latin players, so there's a lot of Spanish being uttered, which I also don't speak Spanish, so there's some things I'm not understanding too when I'm listening to these games. What do you think, Derek Rae with us here on Frame, what do you think of referees and maybe how they're calling the games, not having to deal with this, a Dortmund crowd, where they could, I think we've always pointed to the fact that referees are human and that they could be influenced by certain aspects. But here now that it's just this, are they calling the games better with less one side or the other because of that, do you think?
I think the best referees are still the best referees, and I think they mostly get it right, and I think are probably getting it right to the same percentage. Okay. That would be my impression, but I don't know that for sure. What we do know for sure
this is a good post pandemic interview of the referees to get their really true evaluation of how it went for them.
Yeah, that's right. And I do follow, in the German publications, the top referees do quite regularly give interviews about things like this. And, they'll tell you that the job is still the same, that they're utterly focused on the task at hand. And of course, they're all wired for sound with each other, as they have been for a while now. And I've often wondered if that maybe sort of dampens the effect of the crowds being an influencer on all of this. I mean, I don't know, because I'm not a referee. I've never been in that position. But, I think it still has stress, obviously. It still is a difficult job. I always try to be sympathetic to referees. We can criticize them, but they don't always see what we see, what you and I see on a monitor or with our own eyes. They didn't necessarily have the angle, or they were, watching something else, which is why we have VAR nowadays, but that's a different discussion altogether.
Yeah, well, we're not going to get into that. That'll be another show. We'll do the VAR show someday, Derek.
Look forward to it.
Before we close, I want to talk about some of your World Cup experiences, especially your most recent. So you did the 2019 Women's World Cup in France, 2018 in Russia, the men without the U.S. But your co-commentators in both those events were women.
Yep.
Especially when you're doing a men's World Cup. And I think Ali Wagner, I don't know, I think maybe this was, landmark. This was a unique, it was the first time it happened that a woman was commentating on a men's World Cup. But what was that experience like? And maybe I should just tell you a quick story about Ali Wagner. I was at a pub in New York City watching an England game. I can't remember who they played. They won like 3 or 4-1. Kane had a couple of goals. But you and Ali were doing the broadcast.
Yep.
And what some of the drunk patrons, men, were saying about Ali doing the game and commenting on it was pretty distressing, but, almost what you would expect. So there was a lot of that. So I know you're not Ali to address it. I've already addressed this with her before, and she's tough, but she's also human, just like the referees we referred to. So how did that all go? Your experience, what she had to deal with, that kind of thing.
I really loved working with Ali Wagner. I thought it was a fabulous experience from start to finish. And when Fox, and I hadn't worked for Fox Sports before, when Fox told me that they wanted me to do the World Cup for them, they didn't tell me who my co-commentator would be at the time. That conversation came later. And they explained to me that they thought Ali and I would be a really good partnership because, as you said, they thought, an experienced broadcaster with a lot of World Cups under his belt, with somebody who is also a very good broadcaster, but for whom it's going to be a landmark tournament. There is going to be a lot of media about the fact that a woman is going to be the co-commentator at the World Cup for a major network for the first time. And what I remember when I think back to the whole period, what I remember was probably having more detailed conversations with Ali ahead of the tournament than I've had with any other co-commentator. And, we were in touch, I'm not going to say daily, but it felt like that. We were talking all the time, and she was very inquisitive, which I love to have a co-commentator who's inquisitive. She was always asking me, what do you think about this player? What do you think about, Belgium's midfield? And they seem to change it from this game to that game. What do you think about that? And, I know that she watched everything. She absolutely wanted to know everything to the nth degree in a way that I have not seen from any other co-commentator at a World Cup. And I think she was determined.
Let's face it, you've probably worked with some commentators who did very little homework. I mean, we can identify that if you listen to a broadcast closely, but right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's...
No, there are some co-commentators who come in fully briefed and having done their homework. There are others who turn up, and turn up and talk. Ali Wagner was absolutely in the former category. Yeah. And so by the time the tournament came along, we had done our homework. We felt as though we had done our homework together, and we tried to be a team at all times. And that's what I saw as my job there was to be the ultimate team member with Ali, knowing that Ali was probably going to get the attention. Ali was going to be the one who people talked about, and rightly so, because, it was something brand new. But as the tournament wore on, I think more and more people became aware, and hopefully they liked our partnership that we, if you think about partnerships on the pitch in football, it's not necessarily two players who are exactly the same who make up that partnership. In fact, most of the time it's two complementary figures. Yeah. And I like to think that during that World Cup that Ali gave something that nobody else could give, and hopefully I played my part in that as well, and we dovetailed, and we took it all the way to the quarterfinals, which was not necessarily in the cards at the very start.
That's right.
Ended with England against Sweden, and as I say, I'll always be very grateful to Fox for giving me the chance to work with Ali. I've worked with women before on the air, women co-commentators in England as well as in the USA. Danielle Slayton, who you referenced as well on the Women's World Cup, fantastic in 2019. And with Ali, it really was a joy.
Well, Derek, it's certainly been a pleasure going down the old Derek Rae path from almost start to finish here. I do appreciate your time, and enjoyed reflecting on what you've done, and having a good just a good football chat as well. It's really been fun.
Great fun for me as well, Glenn, and I hope you continue to enjoy the MLS tournaments, and I enjoy your work, and it's always great to catch up with a kindred spirit in our relatively small world of soccer in the USA. I mean, it's an expanding world, but at its core, it's still a small world.
All right. Well, I'll keep retweeting, and eventually one day we'll connect when we're allowed to move about. But Derek, thank you so much, and good luck with everything.
Thanks, Glenn. Anytime.